I should have seen it coming. I guess that's what keeps hitting me the hardest, the fact that all the signs were there, and I chose to ignore them. In hindsight, it's painfully clear. Claire had been drifting away from me for months, maybe even longer. At first, I told myself it was just the strain of work, the stress of raising 2 kids, the grind of life wearing us both down. But deep down, I knew something else was brewing. It wasn't just the usual stresses. It was more. I could feel it in the way she barely looked at me when we were home, how she avoided my touch, and the way she always kept her phone face down, as if she were hiding something. Then there were the late-night work meetings and girls' nights out that started happening more and more frequently. Every time she came home, I could smell the faint hint of perfume that wasn't hers, the kind she never wore around me. The suspicion gnawed at me, but I didn't want to confront it. I didn't want to believe it. One night, about 2 months ago, I saw her packing a suitcase for yet another business trip. The scene played out like it had many times before. She tossed in her usual clothes, nothing special. But then I saw something that hit me like a punch to the gut. Lingerie, the expensive kind, the kind she hadn't worn for me in years, and a box of condoms, tucked neatly under her clothes. I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the suitcase. My mind raced. Why was she packing condoms for a work trip? Why was she bringing lingerie she hadn't worn for me in God knows how long? The answers were there, glaring at me, but I still couldn't bring myself to believe them. "Claire," I said, my voice trembling slightly, trying to sound casual as I pointed to the lingerie. "What's that for?" She didn't even look up from her packing. "Oh, just something for fun. You know, for the girls' night," she replied, brushing it off as if it was the most normal thing in the world. But there was something in her tone, something dismissive, almost detached. It was as if she didn't care if I bought her story or not. I knew she was lying. I knew it deep in my gut. But instead of calling her out right then and there, I did something I never thought I'd do. I walked out of the room, pretending I believed her. I couldn't face the truth. Not yet. The real blow came later that month, at a party thrown by some of Claire's friends, Sarah and David Harper. I should have known from the start that something was off. Claire had been extra excited about this particular gathering. She'd spent days planning what she was going to wear, and when we arrived, she was all smiles and laughter, greeting everyone like they were the best of friends. I hadn't seen her that enthusiastic about anything in a long time. The night started off normal enough, drinks, small talk, the usual gossip. But as the evening wore on, something strange started to happen. Couples began whispering among themselves, giving each other knowing glances. Then Sarah, the hostess, stood up and announced that it was time for the fun part of the evening. That's when I saw it, a large bowl placed in the center of the room. Sarah explained the rules with a gleam in her eye. All the wives were to toss their house keys into the bowl, and then each husband would pick a random key. Whoever's key you picked, you'd spend the night with that person. I felt my stomach drop. My heart started pounding in my chest. I glanced at Claire, expecting her to be as horrified as I was. But to my shock, she wasn't. She was calm, smiling even, as if this was perfectly normal. "Did you know about this?" I hissed, pulling her aside into the kitchen, away from the others. She shrugged, looking at me with that same maddeningly casual expression. "Yeah, I knew. And you didn't think to tell me?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger. "I didn't tell you because I knew you wouldn't agree," she said, her voice cool and unapologetic. "You're damn right I wouldn't agree." I snapped. "I don't want any part of this. We're leaving." But Claire wasn't having it. "We can't leave now, Ethan. It would be rude. Besides, it's just one night. It could be fun. Bring some excitement back into our marriage." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Excitement? You think this is the kind of excitement we need? Sharing each other with strangers?" She looked me dead in the eye and said, "Yes, Ethan. One night won't hurt. I need this." I stood there, stunned, the words catching in my throat. This wasn't the woman I married. This wasn't the woman I had built a life with for 10 years, the mother of my children. She wanted this. She was okay with this. I knew then that my marriage was over. Ignoring her protests, I grabbed her by the arm and dragged her back into the living room. The room was buzzing with anticipation as the other couples gathered around the bowl, ready to pick their keys and spend the night with someone else. But I wasn't going to let that happen. Not with Claire. Not with me. "I'm sorry," I announced, my voice cutting through the chatter. "But Claire and I won't be participating tonight." A few people chuckled nervously, thinking I was joking. But I wasn't. I reached into the bowl, dug through the keys, and pulled out our house key. Holding it up for everyone to see, I added, "This is our key, and I'm taking my wife home." The room fell silent. I could feel the tension in the air, the disapproving stares of the other couples. But I didn't care. I wasn't about to let Claire, or anyone else, destroy what little remained of our marriage. I turned to Claire, her face flushed with embarrassment, but I didn't care. "You have a choice," I told her. "Come with me now, and we can leave this behind. Or stay and don't come home. Ever." For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me, her jaw clenched in anger. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she muttered an apology to the group and reluctantly followed me out of the house. The drive home was silent, but the air between us was thick with tension. Claire sat as far from me as possible, her arms crossed, glaring out the window. I could feel the weight of her anger, but I didn't care. As far as I was concerned, she had betrayed me in the worst way possible. "How could you embarrass me like that?" she finally spat, her voice cold and full of venom. "Embarrass you?" I shot back, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. "You were about to sleep with another man, Claire. What about embarrassing me? What about destroying our marriage?" "It was just one night, Ethan," she snapped. "You could have picked another woman, and we both could have had some fun. It didn't mean anything." I shook my head in disbelief. "It means everything. How can you not see that?" She didn't respond. She just sat there, staring out the window, angry that I had ruined her night. But for me, it wasn't just a ruined night. It was the end of everything I thought we had. As we pulled into the driveway, I realized something with chilling clarity. Claire had already made her choice. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And now I had to decide what I was going to do about it. Underscore, 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 underscore. There's a moment in every man's life when you stop pretending, when the last remnants of denial fall away, and you're left with nothing but the cold, hard truth. For me, that moment came the morning after the Parkers' party. I woke up with Claire already gone, off to work for another long day of meetings, as usual. But something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the way she barely acknowledged me when she left, or the way her phone lit up with a message before she could turn it over, face down, as she always did now. Whatever it was, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The gnawing doubt had turned into an obsession. I had to know the truth. I had to find proof. Claire had already betrayed me once by wanting to take part in that sick key-swapping game. But deep down, I feared it didn't stop there. I had to know for sure, to rip away the last threads of doubt. No more pretending. No more excuses. It started small. I didn't want her to notice anything out of the ordinary, so I kept quiet and let her believe I had forgotten about the party fiasco. I started paying closer attention to everything. Her phone, the way she hurried out of the house, the little changes in her routine that used to go unnoticed. She'd leave for her so-called business trips, but she never seemed hurried to pack. No last-minute work emails or conference calls like before. It was as if she wasn't really going anywhere important at all. It didn't take long for me to start digging deeper. I found an app, one of those location tracking ones that parents use to keep tabs on their kids. I installed it on her phone while she was in the shower one night, nervous sweat trickling down my neck as I worked as quickly as I could. It wasn't hard. Claire wasn't tech-savvy, and I knew her passcode. Once the app was in place, I could see where she was going in real time. The first few days didn't reveal much. Her schedule seemed normal, or at least what she said was normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I needed more than a gut feeling. I needed real proof. Then one afternoon, while she was supposed to be at the office, I watched her location ping. It wasn't at her office building. It was at a hotel. Not the fancy kind either. It was one of those mid-range places out by the freeway, the kind where you could slip in and out unnoticed. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the little dot on the map. She had lied. She wasn't at work. She was there, at that hotel. I felt the room closing in around me. I wanted to scream, to call her right then and demand answers, but I knew better. I had learned my lesson from the party. Confrontation wouldn't do any good unless I had cold, undeniable proof. And I wasn't ready to show my hand just yet. I didn't sleep that night. My mind replayed every lie, every excuse she had ever given me. I thought back to all the times she'd come home late, all the times she said she was working late or grabbing drinks with the girls. I had been a fool. I let her deceive me for God knows how long, and now it was all unraveling. The next morning, I hired a private investigator. His name was Rick Tanner, an ex-cop turned PI, who came highly recommended by a friend of mine who had gone through a similar situation. Rick didn't ask too many questions. He didn't need to. I gave him the basics: my wife, her strange behavior, the hotel. He nodded like he'd heard the same story 100 times before. In a way, it sickened me how routine this seemed for him, but I knew I needed his help. I wasn't equipped to deal with this alone. "Give me a few days," Rick had said, his tone professional but sympathetic. "I'll get what you need." While Rick worked in the shadows, I played the part of the clueless husband at home. Claire continued her charade, leaving for more business trips that I now knew were nothing but lies. I pretended everything was fine, but inside, the rage was building. Every time she smiled at me, kissed me on the cheek before heading out the door, I felt the anger simmering just beneath the surface. The nights were the worst. Lying next to her, knowing she had been with someone else, probably that very same day, was enough to make me feel physically ill. I'd stare at the ceiling, replaying every conversation we'd ever had, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. How could she betray me like this? What had I done wrong? The questions tortured me, but the answers never came. Then, just as Rick had promised, he delivered. He called me one evening after Claire had left for another of her supposed meetings. His voice was calm, but I could sense the gravity of what he was about to tell me. "I've got what you need," he said. I drove to meet him at a small diner on the edge of town. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I could barely breathe by the time I arrived. Rick was already there, sitting in a booth with a manila envelope in front of him. He looked up as I walked in, giving me a nod of acknowledgement. We didn't waste time with pleasantries. He slid the envelope across the table toward me, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, man," he said quietly. I stared at the envelope for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I already knew what was inside, but somehow opening it made it all the more real. My hands trembled as I pulled out the contents: photographs, hotel receipts, timestamps. And there she was, Claire, my wife, walking into the hotel with another man. Over and over again. The same man. I could barely make out his face, but Rick filled in the blanks. "His name's Logan Matthews," Rick explained, his voice low. "He's a client of hers, apparently. They've been seeing each other for months, meeting up at this hotel whenever they can. The photos confirmed it. Claire had been cheating on me with this guy, Logan, for who knows how long. She hadn't just betrayed me that night at the party. This had been going on for much longer than I realized. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The room started spinning, and I had to force myself to breathe. Rick must have seen the look on my face because he leaned forward, his voice softer. "I know this is hard to hear, but now you've got the proof. You know what's really going on?" I nodded, unable to speak. My hands shook as I stuffed the photos back into the envelope. It was all there, laid out in front of me. Every lie, every betrayal. Claire wasn't just having a fling. This was a full-blown affair, and I had the evidence to prove it. "Thanks," I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. Rick gave me a sympathetic look as he stood to leave. "Take care of yourself, Ethan. If you need anything else, you know how to reach me." I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the envelope, my mind racing. I had the proof now. I could confront her. I could throw it all in her face and watch her squirm. But as I sat there, a new thought crept into my mind, a thought that sent a chill down my spine. Confronting her wasn't enough. No, I didn't just want her to admit what she had done. I wanted more. I wanted her to feel the same pain she had inflicted on me. I wanted her to suffer for what she had done, to lose everything the way I had. I wanted revenge. The old Ethan, the man who believed in love, trust, and loyalty, was gone. In his place was someone new, someone colder, more calculating. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just confront Claire and end things there. I had to make her pay. I left the diner that night with a new resolve. I had the proof I needed, but I wasn't going to use it yet. Not until the time was right. I had to be patient. I had a plan, and when the moment came, I would make sure Claire and Logan paid for every single lie, every single betrayal. As I drove home, the envelope resting on the passenger seat beside me, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I wasn't just some victim in this anymore. I was in control. Claire had no idea what was coming, but I was going to make sure it was something she'd never forget. This was just the beginning. When you've seen the truth with your own eyes, something inside you changes. It's like a switch flips, and the person you were before ceases to exist. That's what happened to me the night I received the proof of Claire's betrayal. The pain, the disbelief, the anger, it all melted away, leaving behind something far colder. I wasn't just a hurt husband anymore. I was someone else, someone calculating, someone who knew exactly what he had to do. Claire had no idea that I knew, and that was what gave me power. I decided not to confront her, not to lash out in anger. No, that would be too easy, too satisfying for her. She needed to suffer. She needed to feel the weight of her lies, the crushing burden of guilt, only without knowing why. The morning after meeting Rick, I woke up before Claire like I often did. I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window, sipping my coffee as she got ready for work. I could hear her humming softly as she moved around the house, oblivious to the storm that was brewing inside me. I didn't say anything when she came into the kitchen, kissing me on the cheek like everything was perfectly normal. "See you later, babe," she said, flashing me that smile she used to give me, the one I used to believe meant everything was fine. But now I saw it for what it was, a mask, a hollow expression hiding layers of deceit. I nodded, but I didn't smile back. Just sipped my coffee, watching her go. For a second, she paused, glancing at me with a slight frown. She noticed something was off. I could see it in the way her eyes lingered on me, searching for some sign that everything was still as it had always been. But I was no longer playing the part of the oblivious husband. Claire left for work, and as the door clicked shut behind her, I exhaled. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something deeper, something more dangerous. For the next few days, I kept things cold between us. It wasn't difficult. I had trained myself to hold back, to let her lies wash over me like water off a stone. I didn't react when she told me she had late meetings or after-work drinks. I didn't ask questions or make accusations. I just let her lie, over and over again, each time feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. The more she lied, the easier it became for me to despise her. The love I once felt for Claire had been replaced with something darker, something that felt like a ticking clock counting down to her eventual downfall. She noticed, of course. She wasn't stupid. After 10 years together, she could sense the change in me. She started asking if everything was okay, asking why I was being distant, but I brushed it off. I was careful not to raise suspicion, always giving her just enough reassurance to keep her from digging too deep. I wanted her off balance, unsure of herself. And it worked. She grew more desperate to cover her tracks, but her lies became sloppier. Once, she came home late from work, her hair slightly disheveled, her perfume stronger than usual, probably to mask the scent of Logan. I didn't say a word, just watched her move around the house, her eyes darting toward me every now and then, trying to gauge my mood. But I gave her nothing. No anger, no confrontation, just silence. It wasn't enough for me to make her uncomfortable. I needed more. I needed her to feel like she was losing control. I wanted her to panic. That's when I started doing little things to mess with her head. I'd rearrange items in her purse, move things around in her closet. Subtle changes that she might not notice at first, but would eventually make her feel like something wasn't right. One night, while she was in the shower, I even moved her phone to a different spot in the house. She came out looking confused, asking if I had seen it. I just shrugged, pretending I didn't know what she was talking about. These small acts gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about control, about making her feel as powerless as I had felt when I first realized she was lying to me. Meanwhile, I kept tabs on Logan. I wanted to know everything about him. The man who had taken what was mine. Rick had already dug up some background on him, but I needed more. I started following Logan's social media accounts, piecing together the kind of person he was. He was exactly what I had expected. A smooth-talking womanizer with a reputation for manipulating people. He had been married once, but it didn't last. I wasn't surprised. Men like Logan didn't care about things like commitment or loyalty. They cared about power, about conquest. And Claire had been just another prize for him. I knew I wasn't his first affair, and I doubted I'd be the last. But I didn't care about the other women. What mattered to me was taking him down. He had ruined my life, and now I was going to ruin his. One evening, as Claire was getting ready for yet another work dinner, I couldn't help but watch her from the doorway. She was standing in front of the mirror, fixing her hair, smoothing out her dress. She looked stunning, beautiful in a way that almost made me forget how much I hated her. Almost. "Big night?" I asked, my voice calm. She glanced at me in the mirror, a hint of surprise in her eyes. I hadn't initiated a conversation like this in days. "Yes," she said, forcing a smile. "Just a work thing." I nodded, my expression unreadable. "Have fun." It threw her off balance, that simple comment. I could see it in the way her fingers fumbled with her necklace. She was expecting me to ask more questions, to show some interest in where she was going or who she was meeting. But I didn't, and that made her nervous. As she left the house, I watched her walk down the driveway, her heels clicking against the pavement. She didn't look back, but I knew she could feel my eyes on her. It was time to lay the groundwork for my plan. I started making phone calls. My lawyer was the first person I contacted. I needed to make sure everything was in place before I pulled the trigger. I wanted this to be clean, surgical. I didn't want Claire to have any room to fight back once the truth came out. I also wanted Logan to be exposed, to face the consequences of his actions. After everything he had done, he deserved to lose everything, just like I had. I also contacted Rick again, asking him to keep gathering evidence, more photos, more videos. I needed a solid case, something that would leave no doubt about what had been happening behind my back. Claire and Logan had been careful, but not careful enough. Rick was good at what he did, and I trusted him to deliver the final pieces of the puzzle. While Rick worked on gathering more evidence, I began setting the stage for the confrontation that would end it all. I wasn't going to storm in, shouting accusations. No, that wasn't my style. I wanted Claire to think she was safe, that her lies had worked. I wanted her to believe she still had control. And when the moment was right, I would rip that illusion away from her, leaving her with nothing. But first, I needed to know more about Logan. I needed to understand what kind of man he really was, not just the version he presented to the world. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I reached out to one of his ex-girlfriends. It wasn't hard to track her down. Her name was Jessica, and she had been with Logan for almost 2 years before they broke up. From what I could tell, it had been an ugly split, and she had no love left for him. Jessica was hesitant at first when I called her. She didn't know who I was or why I wanted to talk about Logan. But when I explained the situation, she agreed to meet me. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I needed to hear her side of the story. When she walked in, I could tell she had been through a lot. There was a hardness in her eyes, a bitterness that hadn't been there before. She sat across from me, crossing her arms as if she was trying to protect herself from the memories. "So, you want to know about Logan?" she said, her voice flat. I nodded. "I need to know what kind of person he is, what I'm up against." She gave a bitter laugh. "You're not the first guy to come looking for answers. Logan's good at what he does, making people think he's something he's not. He's a charmer, that's for sure. But underneath it all, he's toxic, manipulative. He'll take whatever he wants, and when he's done, he'll leave you with nothing." Her words hit me hard, but they didn't surprise me. I'd already seen glimpses of that in the way Claire had changed. Logan had gotten inside her head, made her believe she needed him, that he could offer her something I couldn't. "What happened between you two?" I asked, needing to know more. Jessica hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "He used me, made me feel like I was the only one that mattered, but all the while, he was seeing other women behind my back. When I found out, he twisted it, made it seem like it was my fault. He's good at that, making you doubt yourself, making you think you're the crazy one. By the time I finally walked away, I didn't even recognize myself anymore. I clenched my fists under the table, anger bubbling up inside me. Logan had done the same thing to Claire, I was sure of it. But unlike Jessica, Claire didn't see the truth yet. She still thought Logan was her escape, her thrill. I was going to change that. Jessica and I talked for a while longer. She gave me more details about Logan, his patterns, his weaknesses. I absorbed everything, knowing it would be useful when the time came to bring him down. As I left the coffee shop, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Logan had taken everything from me, but I was going to make sure he lost just as much. And Claire, well, she had made her bed. Now she would have to lie in it. That night, I sat at home, waiting for Claire to return from her latest business dinner. The house was quiet, the air thick with tension. I knew the endgame was approaching. Soon, everything would come crashing down around her. Around both of them. I was ready. After weeks of living in quiet, seething anger, I knew it was time to put my plan into motion. Claire's lies, her betrayal, they had all been leading to this. I wasn't interested in simply confronting her. No, that would be too easy, too straightforward. I wanted her to feel the same helplessness I had felt. I wanted her to realize just how much she had underestimated me. It all started with an idea. A weekend getaway, just the two of us. It would be perfect, I told her, a chance to reconnect, to fix whatever had gone wrong between us. Claire, caught between her affair and trying to maintain the illusion of normalcy, didn't hesitate to agree. She thought she still had me fooled. She thought this trip would be her chance to pretend everything was okay between us. But I had a different agenda. For days, I meticulously planned every detail. I scouted the perfect location, a cozy cabin far from the city, isolated enough for us to be alone with no interruptions. I told Claire it was a place where we could shut out the world, away from her constant work trips and my building resentment. She bought it hook, line, and sinker. What she didn't know was that I had rigged the entire cabin. Hidden cameras were placed strategically throughout every room, recording every conversation, every action. I also installed audio recorders in places where she'd feel safe enough to speak freely, by the bed, in the kitchen, even outside near the porch where I knew she might take her private phone calls to Logan. There would be no hiding anymore. Everything she did, everything she said, would be captured in perfect detail. Before the trip, I went through her phone one last time. It was a careful dance. I'd done it enough by now to know her passcode, her patterns. She was still messaging Logan, making plans to see him as soon as we returned. She even had the audacity to send him pictures of herself, promising to make up for the lost time while we were away. I swallowed my disgust and kept moving forward. I couldn't let emotion cloud my judgment now. This was bigger than just my anger. It was about control. I had to stay calm, methodical, and precise. The time for raw emotions had passed. Now it was about executing the perfect trap. The first step of my plan began with Claire, but the second was more ambitious. Logan had a wife. Her name was Julia, and as far as I could tell, she had no idea what was happening behind her back. I found her easily enough. Social media was a treasure trove of information. She and Logan presented themselves as the perfect couple, smiling in photos at events, dinners, vacations. But beneath those smiles, I imagined there were cracks, just like the ones in my marriage. I wondered if Julia, like me, had seen signs but ignored them. Maybe she had brushed off Logan's long absences or late-night meetings. Or maybe she had already suspected, but didn't want to face the truth. Either way, I knew that she needed to know what was happening, and I needed her help if my plan was going to work. Reaching out to Julia was tricky. I couldn't come off as some random angry husband. I needed to approach her carefully, with evidence, so she wouldn't just dismiss me as crazy. I sent her a message, short and to the point. Julia, I'm sorry to bring this to you, but I have information that I believe you need to see. Your husband, Logan, is having an affair with my wife, Claire. I've gathered proof, and I think it's time you knew. If you're open to it, I'd like to meet. We can talk privately. I included my phone number and waited. It took a day for her to respond, and when she did, I could tell she was skeptical. Who wouldn't be? But there was a hint of fear in her message, a sign that maybe, deep down, she already knew. I don't know who you are, but this is a serious accusation. Why should I believe you? I replied immediately. offering to send her the photos and videos I had. The silence that followed was excruciating, but finally, she responded. Send me what you have. I need to know. I sent her a few photos, nothing too incriminating yet, just enough to show that Logan and Claire had been meeting in secret. Her reply came quickly after that. When can we meet? We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe a few days before the weekend trip. I didn't know what to expect from Julia. Would she be angry? Devastated? Or would she try to defend Logan, the way Claire had tried to justify her actions in her mind? Either way, I was prepared for anything. When Julia walked into the cafe, I immediately recognized her from her photos. She was striking, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor that belied the storm brewing inside her. She didn't waste time with pleasantries, sitting down across from me and diving straight into the conversation. Show me everything, she said, her voice steady but strained. I laid out the evidence in front of her. Photos, messages, the videos Rick had collected. As she went through it all, her face remained expressionless, but her hand shook slightly. I could tell she was fighting to keep control. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were hard. How long has this been going on? Months, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. They've been meeting in hotels, restaurants. He's been using your business trips as an excuse to meet with Claire. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. I had no idea, she whispered. I thought we were fine. How could I have been so blind? Her reaction hit me harder than I expected. Seeing someone else go through the same pain I had endured was difficult, but I couldn't let that distract me. I needed her help, and this wasn't just about sympathy, it was about justice. I'm sorry, Julia, I said softly. I know this is a lot, but I have a plan. She opened her eyes, her expression sharp again. What kind of plan? I laid it out for her. How I had rigged the cabin with cameras and recorders, how I intended to confront Claire and Logan with undeniable proof. I explained that the goal wasn't just to end the affair, but to make sure they both faced the consequences publicly. Claire had betrayed me, and Logan had betrayed her. It was time for both of them to pay. Julia listened carefully, nodding slowly as I spoke. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. You want to destroy them, she said, her tone matter of fact. Yes, I replied, not bothering to sugarcoat it. I want them to lose everything. She was silent for a moment, then nodded. All right, I'm in. It was exactly the answer I needed. With Julia on my side, I knew we could make this work. The final piece of the puzzle was in place. The weekend arrived, and Claire was excited about the trip. She had packed her bags, talking about how nice it would be to get away from everything for a few days. She had no idea that this trip would be the beginning of the end. As we drove to the cabin, I kept the conversation light, pretending everything was fine between us. She seemed relieved, maybe even hopeful that we were going to fix whatever had been wrong in our marriage. But as we pulled up to the cabin, I saw her glance at her phone, probably a message from Logan, making sure everything was still on track for their next meeting. The first night went exactly as I had expected. We ate dinner, drank wine, and talked like any other couple on vacation. But every time she excused herself to the bathroom, I knew she was checking her phone, texting Logan. The cameras captured everything, the look she gave her phone, the way she smiled when she thought I wasn't watching. It was all being recorded, every betrayal etched into digital memory. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay next to her, wide awake, thinking about everything that had brought us to this point. The lies, the deception, it had all led to this moment. And soon, it would all come crashing down. The next day, I made sure to give Claire space, knowing she would use it to communicate with Logan. I went for a walk, leaving her alone in the cabin, but I didn't go far. I wanted to be close enough to hear what was happening, to catch her in the act. Sure enough, when I returned, she was on the phone with him. I heard snippets of their conversation, enough to know that they were planning to meet again soon. She told him she loved him, that she missed him, and I smiled, knowing that those words would soon be used against her. Later that evening, I sent Julia a message. It was time. The final confrontation was ready to be set in motion. Julia would confront Logan, and I would confront Claire. Everything had been recorded. Every piece of evidence was in place. There would be no escape for either of them. As I sat across from Claire at dinner that night, watching her laugh and smile as if nothing was wrong. I felt a strange sense of peace. The end was coming, and I was ready for it. The weekend getaway had been tense, but Claire didn't seem to notice how carefully I was studying her every move. I watched her closely, noting each subtle text she sent to Logan when she thought I wasn't looking, every empty smile she flashed when I tried to engage her in conversation. On the surface, everything seemed like it was back to normal, but underneath it all, I was already preparing for what was to come. The moment I had been waiting for had finally arrived. After we returned home, I didn't waste time. I told her we needed to talk. There was no point in dragging this out. I could see the confusion flicker across her face, but she followed me into the living room. I could sense her unease as I sat down, calmly asking her to sit across from me. She hesitated, but complied, her hands fidgeting in her lap. This was it, the moment where everything would unravel. I reached for the folder I had left on the coffee table, the one filled with every piece of evidence I'd gathered. "I know, Claire," I said, my voice calm, almost cold. "I know everything." Her eyes widened, but she didn't speak. At first, there was denial, a flash of disbelief that quickly masked her face. She tried to play innocent. "Know what? What are you talking about?" she asked, feigning ignorance. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I opened the folder and pulled out the first photo. It was a still frame from the surveillance video, showing her with Logan at the hotel. I placed it in front of her, without saying a word. She stared at it, her face paling as she realized there was no escape. "What is this?" she finally muttered, her voice trembling. I leaned back, watching her closely. That's you. That's you meeting Logan at the hotel when you said you were at work. This is just the beginning, Claire. I've got more videos, messages, everything. Don't bother lying. I already know." Her denial turned into anger. "How could you invade my privacy like this?" she snapped, her face flushed with fury. "You had no right to spy on me." I kept my voice steady. "I had every right. You made this decision, Claire. You made it the moment you betrayed me." She was losing control now. The facade she had carefully crafted was crumbling right in front of me. "It wasn't like that," she yelled, her voice cracking. "It wasn't serious. It didn't mean anything. You're overreacting. We can get past this." I stared at her, feeling nothing but a strange sense of detachment. I had expected this, the bargaining, the desperate attempts to justify her actions. It was almost pathetic to watch. "We can't get past this," I said quietly. "You destroyed everything." She stood up suddenly, pacing the room, her hands flying up in frustration. "It was just a mistake. I didn't mean to hurt you. You weren't paying attention to me anymore, Ethan. I felt like I wasn't enough for you." That stung. Her words were designed to make me feel guilty, but I wasn't falling for it. "Not this time. Don't try to blame me for your choices, Claire. You knew what you were doing. You knew exactly what you were risking." She stopped pacing, turning to face me. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking now. "I can fix this. We can fix this. We've been through so much, Ethan. We can make it work." I shook my head slowly. "There's no fixing this, Claire. Not anymore." I could see the realization starting to dawn on her. The understanding that this wasn't just a fight we could walk away from. This was the end. Her face crumpled, and she sank back onto the couch, tears spilling down her cheeks. "What about the kids?" she sobbed. "What are we going to tell them?" For the first time during the conversation, I felt a pang of emotion. Our kids. They didn't deserve this. But this was her doing, not mine. "We'll tell them the truth," I said firmly. "That their mother made a choice, and now she has to live with the consequences." Her sobs grew louder, but I couldn't stay here anymore. I stood up, gathering the folder of evidence. "Logan's going to be dealing with his own mess soon enough," I added, letting the words hang in the air. "This isn't just about us anymore, Claire. You've destroyed more than just our marriage." She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face full of desperation. "Please don't leave. I'm begging you." But there was nothing left to say. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing on the couch, shattered and broken. I didn't look back. As I closed the door behind me, a strange sense of finality settled over me. This was the beginning of the end, for both Claire and Logan. But for me, It was a chance to finally move forward, free of the betrayal that had consumed my life for so long. And, as much as it hurt, I knew it was the only way. When the papers arrived at my door, I wasn't surprised. I had been expecting Claire to make a desperate move, but seeing the restraining order she had filed against me still sent a surge of anger through my veins. The accusations she had made, abuse, manipulation, controlling behavior, it was all fabricated. Lies designed to flip the narrative and paint her as the victim. It was infuriating, but more than that, it was predictable. She was playing her last card, trying to save face in a situation where she had already lost. But I had been ready for this. My lawyer, Alex, was a sharp and seasoned professional. From the moment I showed him the evidence I had gathered, he assured me we had a strong case. "Don't worry, Ethan," he said, leaning back in his chair. "We've got everything we need to dismantle this." The first hearing was scheduled for the following week. As I entered the courtroom, I could feel the tension weighing heavily in the air. Claire was already seated at her lawyer's table, wearing a mask of calm composure. But I knew her better than that. Beneath that exterior, she was unraveling. The cracks were beginning to show, and it was only a matter of time before everything collapsed. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Claire's lawyer wasted no time launching into a tirade of accusations. They painted me as a controlling, vindictive husband, someone who had emotionally and mentally abused Claire throughout our marriage. They emphasized the restraining order, claiming that she had feared for her safety and needed protection from me. It was infuriating to hear, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to remain composed for what was coming next. When it was Alex's turn, he stood with the quiet confidence that had drawn me to hire him in the first place. "Your Honor," he began, "we have evidence that will directly contradict the claims made by Mrs. Weston." He glanced at me before continuing. "The reality of this case is far different from the story presented to this court. My client has been the one wronged here, not Mrs. Weston." He presented the evidence, everything I had meticulously collected. Photos of Claire with Logan, the videos, the text messages, all of it. The courtroom grew eerily silent as each piece of evidence was laid bare, unraveling Claire's web of lies in front of everyone. I watched Claire as the evidence was presented. At first, she tried to maintain her calm demeanor, but as the photos and videos were displayed for the court, her facade began to crack. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Her lawyer seemed just as taken aback, clearly unprepared for the depth of the evidence we had brought. When Alex played the final piece of evidence, the audio recording I had of Claire admitting to her affair, there was no denying the truth. The recording echoed through the courtroom, every word a nail in the coffin of her case. The judge's face remained neutral, but I could see the shift in his demeanor. He was paying close attention now, weighing the facts carefully. Claire's lawyer tried to counter, scrambling to regain control of the situation, but it was clear that their case was falling apart. Then it was Claire's turn to speak. She stood, her voice trembling as she tried to paint herself as a victim. "I made a mistake," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "But I was unhappy. I was lost, and I didn't know how to fix things. Ethan never listened to me. He never understood how lonely I was." Her performance was convincing. At least, it would have been if I hadn't already seen through her. But the judge wasn't swayed. The evidence was too strong, too clear. And as Claire's story fell apart, so did she. Her desperation became more apparent with each passing moment. She tried to appeal to the judge, to the lawyers, to anyone who would listen. But no one could ignore the facts. She had betrayed me, destroyed our marriage, and now she was grasping at straws, trying to salvage whatever she could. The hearing dragged on for hours, but I remained steady, knowing we were winning. Alex didn't let up, relentlessly dismantling every argument Claire's lawyer attempted to make. By the end of the day, it was clear that our side had the upper hand. But it wasn't over yet. The judge called for a recess, and when we reconvened, the focus shifted to the custody of our children. This was the part that mattered most to me. Losing Claire had been painful, but losing my kids, that was something I couldn't bear. Claire's lawyer tried to argue that I was unfit to have full custody, using the same baseless accusations of control and emotional abuse. But Alex was ready. He presented evidence of my role as a father, photos, testimonies from family and friends, and more proof that I had been the primary caregiver in many ways. The judge listened intently, asking questions and making notes. As the case for custody unfolded, I could see Claire's resolve crumbling. Her bravado was gone, replaced by fear and desperation. And when the subject of Logan was brought up, his involvement with her, his presence around our children, Claire's expression shifted. She hadn't anticipated that part of her life being exposed so publicly. Logan wasn't in the courtroom, but his presence loomed large over the proceedings. He had started distancing himself from Claire the moment things got messy. I wasn't surprised. Men like him always bailed when the consequences became too real. Claire had been left to deal with the fallout alone, and now it was clear she was losing everything. The legal battle became more personal with each passing hour. It wasn't just about custody or property anymore. It was about pride, about who would walk away from this with their life intact. For me, it was about protecting my kids and ensuring that Claire's actions didn't destroy them the way she had destroyed our marriage. For Claire, it was about survival. She was trying to salvage whatever was left of her life. But the harder she fought, the more obvious it became that she was outmatched. As the day wore on, I watched her unravel. She was no longer the composed, confident woman I had once known. She was desperate, broken, and defeated. And as much as it should have brought me satisfaction, all I felt was a hollow sense of inevitability. This was the path she had chosen, and now she was paying the price. When the judge finally adjourned the court, it was clear that the decision was looming. We had one more hearing scheduled, and then the judge would make his final ruling. On custody, on property, on everything. Claire didn't look at me as we left the courtroom. She kept her head down, her face pale and drawn. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she barely acknowledged him. I could see the weight of what was happening crushing her. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt a strange sense of relief. The fight wasn't over yet, but we were close. I had done everything I could to protect my kids, and now it was in the hands of the court. The next hearing would decide everything. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like the end was in sight. But for Claire, this was only the beginning of her downfall. The morning of the final hearing felt heavy, like a dark cloud hovering over everything. This was the day that would determine everything. My children's future, Claire's fate, and in many ways my own. After weeks of legal battles and emotional strain, it all came down to this. I was prepared, but the weight of what I had gone through in the past months settled deep in my chest. I arrived at the courthouse early, my lawyer, Alex, by my side. His calm confidence was reassuring, but even I could tell that today would be no easy fight. Claire's team had been vicious in their attempts to paint me as the villain, using every trick they could to sway the court in her favor. They had painted me as an abuser, a man who controlled and manipulated her. But today, the truth would finally come out, and I was ready for it. As I entered the courtroom, I saw Claire sitting at the other table. Her once confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a hollow, tired expression. She looked pale, her eyes darting around nervously as if she knew what was coming. The months of lies and deception were catching up with her, and it showed. She had no idea just how much her life was about to unravel. Logan wasn't there. He had been noticeably absent since the legal proceedings intensified. From what I had gathered, he was trying to distance himself from Claire, hoping to avoid the fallout. Cowardly, but predictable. Men like him never stuck around when things got tough. The judge entered, and the room fell into a tense silence. This was it, the final battle. Claire's lawyer, a slick, fast-talking man who had spent weeks spinning a web of lies, began by once again trying to portray me as a controlling, abusive husband. He leaned heavily into the narrative that Claire had been a victim, forced into an affair out of loneliness and emotional neglect. He spoke about how Claire had been isolated, how I had manipulated her, and how she had no choice but to seek solace elsewhere. It was infuriating to listen to. Every word felt like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had learned that anger wouldn't get me anywhere in this courtroom. Alex had coached me on this. No outbursts, no emotional reactions. The truth was on our side, and it was time to let the evidence do the talking. When it was Alex's turn to present our case, he rose with quiet authority. "Your Honor," he began, "we've heard a lot of claims about my client's supposed behavior. But today, we will show you the reality of this situation." He methodically went through the evidence we had gathered, the GPS records, the photographs, the messages between Claire and Logan. It was all laid out in stark detail, each piece of evidence more damning than the last. The room was silent, the tension palpable, as Alex dismantled Claire's defense piece by piece. Then came the audio recordings, the ones where Claire had admitted to her affair, where she had mocked my feelings and talked about how she had no regrets. As the recordings played, I watched Claire. She flinched with every word, her face growing paler by the second. The lies she had carefully crafted were crumbling around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. When the final recording ended, Alex paused, letting the weight of the evidence sink in before speaking again. "Your Honor, what we have here is not a case of a victimized woman seeking refuge from an abusive husband. What we have is a woman who betrayed her family, manipulated the truth, and tried to frame my client to cover her own indiscretions." Claire's lawyer tried to object, but it was clear that their case was falling apart. The judge silenced him with a wave of his hand and turned to Claire. "Mrs. Weston," he said, his voice stern, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Claire stood slowly, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. For a moment, it looked like she might break down right there, but she managed to pull herself together. I made mistakes," she stammered, her voice weak. "But it wasn't like that. I was lost and I didn't know how to fix things." Her words sounded hollow, even to me. The judge wasn't buying it either. "And what about the fabricated abuse claims?" the judge pressed. "Why did you file a restraining order against your husband if there was no abuse?" Claire's eyes darted to her lawyer, searching for an answer, but none came. Finally, she muttered, "I was scared. I thought it was the only way to protect myself." "Protect yourself from what?" the judge asked, his voice sharp. "From the consequences of your own actions?" Claire didn't answer. She couldn't. The truth was out, and there was no hiding from it now. As the judge continued to question her, it became clear that Claire had no defense left. Her lies had been exposed, her manipulation laid bare for everyone to see. I watched as she unraveled, the weight of her actions crashing down on her. This wasn't the woman I had married all those years ago. She had become a stranger to me, someone I no longer recognized. But even as her world crumbled, I felt no satisfaction, just a deep, hollow sense of loss. This wasn't the victory I had imagined. Yes, the truth had come out, and yes, I had won. But at what cost? When the focus shifted to custody, my heart raced. This was what mattered most to me, my children. Claire's lawyer tried to argue that she was the better fit as a parent. But after everything that had been revealed, it was a weak argument at best. Alex, as always, was prepared. He presented evidence of my role as a father, showing the judge that I had been a constant presence in my children's lives. He painted a picture of a stable, loving home, one that I could provide, even as Claire's personal life spiraled out of control. The judge took it all in, nodding thoughtfully as he listened. And then, finally, he spoke. After reviewing the evidence and hearing both sides, the judge began. "It is clear to me that Mr. Weston has acted in the best interest of his children throughout this process. Mrs. Weston, on the other hand, has demonstrated behavior that calls into question her ability to provide a stable environment for her children." My heart pounded as I waited for the ruling. "The court awards full custody of the children to Mr. Weston," the judge declared. "Mrs. Weston will have supervised visitation rights, pending further review." It was over. I had won. Claire let out a choked sob, her hands flying to her face as the reality of the situation sank in. She had lost her children, her marriage, everything. Logan was nowhere to be found, having abandoned her when things got difficult. She was alone, left to deal with the mess she had created. As the judge concluded the hearing and the courtroom began to empty, I sat there for a moment, letting it all sink in. I had fought for months, endured the lies, the manipulation, the betrayal. And now, I had come out the other side victorious, but at a cost. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of everything that had happened bearing down on me. Claire was still sitting at the table, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with sobs. For a moment, I felt a pang of pity, but it was quickly overshadowed by the memory of what she had done. The lies, the betrayal, the way she had tried to destroy me to save herself. I walked past her without a word, not even glancing back. This chapter of my life was over. As I stepped out of the courtroom into the bright afternoon sunlight, I felt a strange sense of emptiness. I had won, but the scars of what I had been through would stay with me forever. The betrayal, the pain, it wasn't something that could just be erased. But I had my children, and I had my freedom. And that was enough. For now. The days following the court ruling were a blur of emotions, ranging from relief to exhaustion. I had won the custody battle, secured my children's future, and laid Claire's manipulative games to rest. But even with the victory, a part of me felt hollow. The past months had taken their toll, leaving scars that wouldn't fade easily. Returning home with the kids after the courtroom showdown, I tried to ease back into a sense of normalcy. It was a strange feeling, being in the house that Claire and I had once shared, but now the rooms felt emptier, as though the memories had been stripped bare. The space between us was gone, and all that remained was the quiet echo of what had once been our life together. For the sake of the kids, I pushed through the motions, breakfast together, helping with homework, taking them to soccer practice. They were my anchor now, the reason I stayed grounded. But the quiet moments alone, after they had gone to bed, were the hardest. The silence felt heavy, like a weight on my chest. The nights felt longer, filled with the lingering thoughts of everything that had happened, everything that had been lost. Claire was out of our lives now. After the hearing, she had retreated into herself. I hadn't heard from her since, but I knew she had to be hurting. How could she not be? The life she had built on lies had crumbled in front of her, and she had no one to blame but herself. Part of me wondered if she truly understood the magnitude of what she had done, or if she was still rationalizing it all in her head, trying to convince herself that she was the victim in all of this. But that wasn't my concern anymore. I was done thinking about Claire. The door to that chapter of my life was closed, and now I had to focus on moving forward. The problem was I wasn't sure how. Julia and I had stayed in touch after everything unfolded. She had reached out to me in the weeks before the trial, after I had sent her the proof of Logan and Claire's affair. Her voice on the phone had been strained, hurt, but there was an underlying strength there, something that had drawn me to her. We shared something now, a deep understanding of betrayal, of the pain that comes when the person you thought you knew becomes a stranger. After the dust settled, we met for coffee a few times. At first, it was just to talk, to vent, to share stories, to try and make sense of it all. Julia's situation with Logan had mirrored mine with Claire in so many ways. Logan had tried to downplay his involvement, but Julia wasn't naive. She had seen through his lies and, like me, was taking steps to end her marriage. She had always been strong, but now she was resolute, focused on rebuilding her life without Logan's shadow looming over her. As the weeks passed, our conversations shifted. They became less about our pasts and more about what came next. We had both been through hell, but we were still standing. I found comfort in Julia's company. Her presence was like a balm for the raw wounds left by Claire's betrayal. She understood the pain, but more than that, she understood the need to move beyond it. There was no pity between us, no lingering sadness about what we had lost. Instead, there was a shared determination to rebuild, to find something better, something stronger. It didn't happen all at once. There were no grand declarations of love or sweeping romantic gestures. It was slow, quiet, and real. Julia and I had both been burned, and neither of us was in a rush to jump into anything new. But over time, I started to realize that with her, I felt hopeful. For the first time since the affair, I could see a future that wasn't tainted by betrayal or bitterness. It was just life, and that felt like enough. The kids liked her too. Julia was gentle with them, never overstepping her boundaries, but always kind and patient. She had a way of making them laugh, of bringing lightness into the room that I hadn't realized I had missed. Watching her with them, I couldn't help but feel something stir inside me, a small spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find happiness again. That we could find happiness again. As for Claire, I didn't hear much from her after the trial. She had supervised visitation with the kids, but those meetings were tense and brief. I could see the guilt weighing on her when she picked them up, her eyes avoiding mine, her voice quiet and strained. I wasn't sure if she had fully accepted what she had done, or if she was still trying to justify it to herself. But at this point, it didn't matter. She was no longer a part of my world. She was just a memory now, a painful one, but a memory nonetheless. The last I heard, Logan had completely distanced himself from Claire. Once the scandal broke and the affair became public knowledge, he had done everything he could to salvage what was left of his own life. But the damage was done. His career had taken a nosedive, and he was barely holding on to what little respect he had left. As for Claire, I imagine she was struggling to rebuild her own life. The woman who had once been so confident, so sure of herself, was now a shell of who she used to be. I didn't take any joy in that, though. Seeing Claire fall apart didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it would. There was no sense of victory, no feeling of triumph. In the end, I had lost something too, something deeper than the marriage itself. Trust, innocence, a belief in the stability of love. Those were things that would take a long time to rebuild, if they ever did at all. One evening, months after the trial, I found myself sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The kids were asleep, the house was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Julia sat beside me, her hand resting on mine, the simple act of her presence comforting in a way that words couldn't describe. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that I had missed for so long. "Yeah," I replied, glancing over at her. "We have." We sat in silence for a while, the cool breeze brushing past us. It wasn't the beginning of something new, not yet, but it was the end of something old, and that was enough for now. "I don't know what the future holds," I said after a long pause, "but I'm ready to find out." Julia smiled, her fingers gently squeezing mine. "So am I." And in that moment, I realized that I was free, not just from Claire, but from the weight of the past. The betrayal, the lies, the anger. It was all behind me now. I wasn't defined by what had happened anymore. I was free to start over, to rebuild, to move forward. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't looking back. And that, I thought, was the greatest victory of all. In the end, Claire was left to pick up the pieces of the life she had shattered. Alone, with no one to turn to, she faced the consequences of her choices. Her affair with Logan had cost her everything: her marriage, her children, and the respect of those who had once been close to her. The life she had so carelessly destroyed could never be rebuilt, and I doubted she would ever fully understand the weight of what she had done. But that was no longer my concern. My life, my future, belonged to me now. I had fought my battles, faced my demons, and come out the other side. I had won custody of my children, reclaimed my dignity, and found someone who understood the depth of my pain. Julia and I were both scarred, but we were stronger because of it. We had survived the storm, and now we were ready to face whatever came next. As the sun set on that quiet evening, I realized that I was no longer a man defined by betrayal. I was a man who had rebuilt himself from the ground up, stronger, wiser, and free. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The past was behind me, and the future, well, the future was mine to shape.